All right, golfers, I want to use this video to talk about early forearm rotation in the golf swing. And we're going to use one of my online students here as an example. Now, I'm going to post two videos, one today and one later this week, regarding this forearm rotation. And the purpose of these two separate videos is to show you one example where it actually creates problems in the golf swing, meaning because the golfer rotates the forearms early, there are bad habits that are being created for later on. And another example, which I'll do later this week, where a golfer is going to actually rotate the forearms early, but they're going to create some pretty good habits later in the golf swing, meaning the top of the backswing is going to be aligned in some good spots, the transition is going to be pretty efficient, and so trying to get rid of the forearm rotation for that player would be merely aesthetic. Okay. And that's something that I cannot stress enough is that just because you roll the forearms in the takeaway does not automatically imply that it needs to be removed in your golf swing. Some golfers can actually overcome and get away with it, but that's obviously not always the case. Now, this golfer actually creates problems because of the forearms, and I want to show you, okay? So right off the bat, you're going to see in the takeaway as he starts to take the club back, the two most obvious patterns that you'll see with golfers who rotate the forearms early on. Number one, the face angle is going to be very open in the takeaway, so you'll see the toe of the club head pointing up and behind the player. And number two, the shaft gets caught really flat and really inside the hands. So obviously this club head is quite a bit behind the hand path of the player early in the takeaway, and you'll see the lead arm start to rotate up and to the right, and you'll see the trail arm start to rotate underneath and to the right. And that is a very common pattern of obviously a right-handed player here who rotates the forearms. So as this player goes up, the visual reference I always like to give is not necessarily that the shaft is going back very flat. Of course, that is one of the byproducts of it. But the obvious would be take a look at the palm's positioning of this player's hand. So you're going to see that the palm of the glove hand is pointing down to the ground. You're going to see the palm of the trail hand is pointing up to the sky. That is a very regular occurrence with golfers who excessively rotate the forearms in the takeaway. And so again, of course, the shaft is going to go back very flat, and of course the face angle is going to be open. But those aren't the only visuals that you'll see. I actually quite like to look at the palm of the hands to showcase forearm roll. Now, because this player rotated the forearm so much in the takeaway, yes, his face angle is compromised. Yes, the shaft is obviously moving poorly. But what you're going to see, and this is really where all of the problems come together, is that there is a direct reaction to the fact that this player rotated the forearms early. What does that mean? What it means is because he rotates his forearms open in the backswing to an excessive amount, later near the top of the backswing and in transition, he's going to do the inverse. What does the inverse mean? It means that he's actually going to rotate the forearms to his left, meaning he's going to rotate his forearms closed in transition. Now, for a right-handed player, that does something very penalizing. It steepens the shaft really aggressively. So what you're going to see is that halfway back, which would be considered, or even 2/3 of the way back, let's call it, which would be P3, position 3. You see that again, the palm of his glove hand is pointing way down to the ground. Yes, the shaft is flat. Yes, the face angle is open, right? You're going to see where his shaft angle is here. Well, as he goes up near the top and he reacts poorly to that position as he's coming down, well, what is the obvious difference here? Number one, the shaft is coming down on a much steeper plane than it was going back. So lo and behold, you just found a reason to get rid of the early forearm roll, right, in the takeaway. The takeaway created a position to the forearms, which then led to a certain movement of the forearms later in the golf swing, which is now steepening the shaft. So there you go. Now you found a reason to get rid of the takeaway problem, right? And what did I mention? I said I like to look at the palm of the hand when we're referring to forearm roll. If you remember in his takeaway, the palm of his glove hand points down to the ground, right? That's the case right away early in the takeaway. And obviously that is sustained for a large portion of his backswing because of the fact that he's rotated his forearms open. Well, what you're going to see is that if you look at the palm of his hand now halfway down, it is in a much different orientation. The palm of his glove hand is pointing behind him now, not to the ground. The palm of his trail hand is actually pointing in front of his body. And so now you have a visual reference where the forearms were placed in a certain way in the takeaway. And because it was extreme and it was rotated so far to the right in his takeaway, he then rotated them very extremely to his left in the downswing, in transition to the downswing, and then obviously in the downswing. And that created a much steeper shaft angle coming down. So now the problem is, because his shaft is moving so poorly, very specifically because of the forearms, you're going to see the shaft is going to come down on a much steeper plane than it was going back in that same position. So halfway back, his shaft angle was in a certain spot, which was obviously very flat. And then from there, you saw how his shaft reacted. So near the top of the backswing, it stood up, and then the forearms kept going that direction. So the shaft started to steepen and get thrown out in front of his body. So the shaft now coming down is on a much steeper plane than it was going back. So all of a sudden, his club movement is compromised because of the forearms. So lo and behold, you just figured out a reason why this golfer creates bad habits. It also comes back to the fact that he rotated his forearms in the takeaway. If he were to inverse those movements, meaning he's kept his forearms closed in the takeaway, and then he actually rotated them open in transition, believe it or not, he would have a much different shaft movement. He would have the inverse. It would go back steeper and come down more shallow. He wouldn't have nearly the same problems. Now, the ripple effect, obviously, of because he's now steepening his shaft, because his forearms are moving so poorly, you're going to see a lot of early extension from this player. So you see where his spine was, let's say, at the top of his swing, and then as he comes down, you can see how he gets very, very upright, right? His spine is obviously much more vertical in the fall through. He's completely released his hands here, standing up, straightened his arms out to try to find a way to get the club somewhat in position. So all of the stuff that you see with his body jumping up so much through impact, you need to understand that that is a direct reaction to the poor club movement, which at the end of the day stems from the forearm roll. So yes, this golfer in particular has created a bunch of bad habits because of his early forearm rotation. But what you're going to see in future videos I'm going to post is that that's not always the case. Sometimes golfers actually overcome the takeaway piece and they get the club in a pretty good spot at the top. They get the club moving pretty well in transition. And in a situation like that, the takeaway is merely aesthetic. Yes, it's not great. We don't like the idea of what it looks like, but it's not always the root cause of everyone's problems. So what you see here, if you ever want to look at forearm rotation, a good visual is always looking at where the hands specifically are pointing. The palm of the hands will give you a good indication of the positioning of each arm.